The environment from a sort of botanist point of view is what I want to talk about. And in the second half, I want to discuss the idea of climate change and what is a theory. We always hear about theories, we hear about facts, and there is a public misunderstanding, I think, that's extremely important, and it distracts us from the sensible debates we should be having. What is the environment? Well, it's very obvious. It's the world around us, and it's every aspect of it. Human beings are simply one more animal on this planet. We behave very, very differently from the rest of biological life, and that is at the heart of the problem that we face today. The environment in its absolute sort of essence, we can look at it as the biosphere. This is a view of the four elements of the ancient, so to speak: earth, wind, fire, and water. Air, water, and soil is what the earth is built on, and the biodiversity that lives upon that generates the biosphere. It is this flow of energy. And the flow of energy from the sun, captured by plants, passed on to animals and fungi, it rots down, it builds the soil, and it provides the seedbed for those plants to regrow. It's a fantastic cycle and of immense importance that we try and convey a general understanding of that to the public at large. There is also another aspect of the environment, which is how we use it. Now, these are often referred to as ecosystem services. The rainwater that falls, our drinking water, literally is largely purified by the world at large. The environment does that purification. We get nearly all our fish from the oceans to this day. They are simply harvested from the wild. Pollination services of immense importance to many of our crops is the wildlife around. Blue tits serve the vital role of pest control. Yes, we use pesticides, insecticides and so on, but the actual value of the biodiversity around us is immense. In Ireland, it is calculated at least €500 million a year. Very, very difficult to come up with those estimates, but €500 million per year is what a lot of economists, agronomists and so on would put that figure at. Then there is the wider use that we make of that environment, not so much ecosystem services, but sometimes the sort of threats that we see in the environment or the benefits we gain from it. These are very, very diverse and broad, and often very difficult to sort of quantify how much is being provided, in essence, purely by the environment itself, and how much by the intervention of human beings. A look at Killary Harbour gives you a quick understanding of the two sides of that coin. The economic usage of that water system for mariculture, growing of oysters and mussels, and also salmon farms, versus the wild ecology of that site to tourism and so on. And this is a famous problem in Irish landscape use out in the west. This is Hungry Hill on the Beara Peninsula, and the simple adage, this great truism, is you cannot eat the view. If you live in that environment, that hill landscape is extremely harsh, very low productivity. Yes, it might be great for tourism, but how is that of benefit to local people unless they're involved in the trade? And it was on that hill there in the 1970s that an extraordinary and audacious idea was coined by James Lovelock, somebody who had immense knowledge of CFCs and the damage being caused to the ozone layer. And he came up with the idea of the Gaia hypothesis, that essentially the entire biosphere, the world that we see, the living world around us, acted like a living organism. It had feedbacks and controls, and it essentially managed itself. But the impact of human beings on that has been, by and large, nothing short of disastrous. So James Lovelock first coined that idea, and he has been churning out various books ever since. The most recent, The Revenge of Gaia, is one that he has actually recanted on somewhat, which is essentially that there is no hope for the human race, and the best thing we can do is try and record our knowledge for future generations. This is probably one of the biggest problems with the media, is the idea of hopelessness, that there is nothing we can do against this tidal wave of destruction around us, and it's a very negative light that we paint the world into our children. And I think many people are disheartened by it, to the extent that, as has been mentioned several times today, we would get parodied as tree huggers who are not in touch with the real world. One of the extraordinary sort of ideas of the world is how interrelated it is. And an astronomer, an American astronomer, Shapley, was the person who first came up with a wonderful thought experiment. Shapley was the first person to actually position our Earth inside the Milky Way. He was able to triangulate our position and place us in the universe, so to speak. But Shapley had this thought experiment, and it revolves around argon gas. Argon gas is a very interesting gas. It's a so-called noble gas. It never changes. It does not react with anything. It forms 1% of our atmosphere, so it's the third biggest component of the atmosphere. And every time we take a breath, a single human breath, we inhale 3 or 30 quintillion atoms of argon. That's an enormous amount, 3 times 10 to the 19. It's only making up 1% of the volume of our lungs. But a single breath of argon, or a single breath of the atmosphere, when I breathe that out, just one breath, I can breathe that out. And then I can travel anywhere in the world 1 year later, and every single breath I take in 1 year's time, I will inhale 15 atoms from that original breath. This gives you an idea of what is happening on the globe today in terms of pollution and so forth. Each breath I take, I'm taking in atoms that are essentially have unchanged through millions, if not billions of years. Those atoms of argon have literally never reacted with anything. They're still there. Each breath I take, I'm breathing in argon atoms that Tyrannosaurus rexes, Buddha, Jesus Christ also breathed. And this gives us a very clear view of the interconnectedness of the atmosphere. One of the other great notions is a simple idea that food chains, things, plants grow from sunlight, animals eat the plants, animals die, build the soil, plants grow again. But actually the world is more complicated than that. And a very recent discovery with the kudu, one of the biggest antelopes in Africa, is that it has an extraordinary relationship with the tree that it grazes on, acacia. These acacia plants, as soon as they're grazed by any large animal, release ethylene gas, and they fill their leaves with tannins, such that they become toxic. And if you confine a kudu to a small area of land, say 30 or 40 hectares, it will die of starvation, even with a full stomach, because the plants, all the trees around it, are toxic. Essentially, it needs a big range of about 100 hectares, and it roams around that area, and the trees recover from their grazing, and several weeks later they become edible again. So here is an extraordinary relationship where we see that a plant actually makes it toxic to its predator, and then given time it recovers, and there is a balance between the numbers of kudus and the number of acacia plants. In the biological world, there is always a natural balance of things. You go to Achill Island today, you see huge areas of gunnera. This extraordinary plant, often referred to as giant rhubarb, grows all over Achill Island. 15, 16 years ago you went to Achill, it was extremely rare. There were small little clumps of it. It's highly invasive in Achill because it comes from South America, it has no predators there, and it has completely outstripped the landscape. There are thickets, 10 hectares in extent, of gunnera now. It grows 2 to 3 meters tall, and there is almost no other biological life around other than the gunnera plant. And it's a great example of what happens when no controls are placed upon biological life. And essentially that is what human beings have ended up doing. We have an innate inability to visualize or even to comprehend what we're doing. The bison of North America, a fine example of overexploitation, virtually eliminating a species that was once considered so numerous that it would be impossible, you would think, to eradicate it. We are still doing the same to our bogs today in Ireland, and yet those of us who understand the biological principles of how these bogs grow, it is nothing short of disastrous. The only limit to that should be European law, and we've already heard that it is almost powerless to stop it in this country. And it is a great tragedy that people don't understand the principles. Here are 4 sort of examples of some of the problems that we face globally, and yet all of these global problems can be solved locally. Patrick Geddes, who I will talk about in a moment, came up with the wonderful idea of acting locally and thinking globally. That albatross killed by all the plastic in its gut, if we conscientiously were to recycle our waste, that would not happen. Bottom left, if we take care not to eat fish harvested from unsustainable resources, we would not get a repeat of the collapse in the cod industry in the North Atlantic. The top right, that is an example of oil palm being grown in northern Borneo. If we conscientiously avoid using oil palm products or soya grown in the tropics. Bottom right, if we avoid buying cheap furniture from IKEA, the destruction of rainforests is severely limited. So, of course, there's a huge number of actions that we can take locally. This is a great statement. Who would have thought that Groucho Marx came up with such a succinct and powerful idea? That is so true, isn't it? And it is frightening that us human beings cannot understand the importance of looking after future generations. Some of the great examples around the globe of environmental collapse, such as Easter Island. This happened only in the probably 16th or 17th century, where overexploitation of an island literally destroyed the biosphere there. When European sailors first came upon the population of Easter Island, they were living in abject poverty, and yet, in the recent past, they had had an extraordinary civilization. The Mayan civilization of Central America, probably even more extreme. Probably around the 9th or 10th century, this entire system collapsed. Huge city-states. And probably what had happened is they had destroyed the environment. They had reduced their rainfall, and it literally led to a loss of productivity. And Patrick Geddes, who I mentioned earlier, Patrick Geddes was this Scottish philosopher, biologist, but also town planner with immense sort of prescience of how the world works. And he pointed out how the world is made of leaves. It is by leaves that we live. It is a green world that we are in. And he said it's strange that some people think the world works on money. Somehow the world runs on the process of money. That energy is generated by the circulation of coins. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is from leaves that we obtain everything on this earth. And it is not the jingling of coins in our pockets, but the fullness of our harvests that makes the world work. And yet it's a lesson that none of us seem to be able, as a society, to learn. How can we protect the environment? Well, essentially, that's what we're here today to discuss. What are the means to protect that environment? To my mind, one of the most important ones is education. And I think if you were to put, I think it's been mentioned today, that were we to put this to a plebiscite tomorrow, the idea of encapsulating the environment in the Constitution, it could well fail. We need to educate people first. We need to actually instill an idea that there's an ethical importance to not only present generations, but future generations, that we protect the environment. Legislation is probably the best means by which we are protecting the environment at the moment. And as Sharon has pointed out, it is these international environmental agreements, these European agreements, that are sometimes some of the biggest drivers. However, their implementation, their actual enactment within the states themselves is often lagging way behind the noble thoughts and ideas that went into them. But marshaled against that is this problem of economics, this misnomer, this terrible idea that technology will solve these problems, and essentially a trust, a belief in scientists' opinions. Doomsdayers saying, the end of the world is nigh, is a very dangerous state to get ourselves into unless we look at a very positive message about the environment. That is a typical newspaper headline, and I was intrigued to see that there is Miss Panty Bliss way back in 2007 making headlines. But half of Irish people fear global warming. Global warming is an extremely interesting problem from the point of view of a scientist. It's an absolutely useless scientific theory, and I'll explain why. And because it's a bad theory, a poor scientific theory, it leads to a great deal of media speculation. What do we really know about climate change? The amount of information the media gives us is astonishing in its diversity of views, and also its immensity of the misleading ideas of what is encapsulated in the notion of climate change. These are some of the sort of headline figures that one might see, that the temperature of the globe is going up, the carbon dioxide is rising, the oceans are warming, the seas are rising, and there at the very bottom, 90% certainty that we are to blame. Well, what does that mean? What's 90% certainty? Let me give you a very breathtaking fact. Since the 1970s in the Botanic Gardens, we have been recording the date at which leaves, flowers appear on plants, the date at which leaves fall off trees. This is a study called phenology, and it's conducted on animals, insects, migratory birds, butterflies, and so forth. It is the cycle of nature. Now, flowering currants used to put out their leaves in the 1970s around the 14th of April. By the 1990s, it was the 25th of March. By 2012, a very warm spring indeed, it was the 10th of March. That's an astonishing increase in the date, or a bringing forwards, if you like, of spring. Spring begins in the south of Europe and it advances like a wave towards the north. Our trees, on average, in this country are bearing their leaves about 3 weeks earlier than they were 40 years ago. They're dropping their leaves almost 10 days to 2 weeks later than they used to. The length of the growing seasons increased by at least a month in 40 years. But there is something more staggering still about that. In the same way that this wave of spring moves northwards across Europe, there is a speed at which climate change is overtaking these plants, and it is 40 foot a day. It is the width of this room every single day. In a year, that is 4 kilometres. Essentially, it means as though we here in Dublin have moved southwards through a climatic zones by 40 kilometres every 10 years. So over the past 40 years, that's 160 kilometres. We'd be off the south coast of Ireland by now. That is a horrific rate, is it not? Now, what is the physical evidence of climate change? Well, we know that the anomalies of temperature variation have increased greatly. So in the recent decade or two, we have seen some of the hottest temperatures measured since records began, that old mantra one hears on television and in the media the whole time. We also know that carbon dioxide is steadily increasing year upon year, and it is already massively greater than at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That just goes to show, when you look up close, that every spring carbon dioxide levels actually drop slightly in the northern hemisphere because of the amount of growth of trees and other plants absorbing it. Why is it a bad scientific theory? Well, a good scientific theory is falsifiable. When Charles Darwin came up with the idea of natural selection being the cause of evolution, you could falsify that. You could discover a fossil of a human being in the Cretaceous period amongst dinosaurs and say, well, obviously there's a huge problem that is not being explained by his theory. Albert Einstein, even better, the theory of relativity and general relativity, he spent a great deal of time saying these are falsifiable. If we can see that sunlight from a star passing a major planet or our sun, or the orbit of Mercury can be measured accurately enough, you will be able to disprove my theory. And the answer is, nobody's been able to disprove it. These are good scientific theories. Unfortunately, with climate change, which essentially hogs the centre ground of any environmental debate, is not a good scientific theory. We have no idea if that red line is really going to happen or not. That is like fortune telling. We can look at what models suggest with different temperature regimes in the future, but there the little black bars are the actual observed. They're never quite the same, and it's very difficult to get it right. What I would say straight away, and the vast majority of scientists looking at this data, is the case is extremely well proven, but it is still not a good scientific theory. And unfortunately, that is what the media alights upon. So I hope I've given you a quick resume there that, yes, there is huge scientific evidence that the environment is of immense importance to us human beings. We live by plants, we live by the biosphere, and if we do not pay attention to it, it will be of immense problems to future generations. Having said all that, why do human beings not recognize this? Why can we never recognize this other than a small minority of people such as yourselves gathered in this room who would have a comprehension of it? And it is essentially a process of education. And at the Botanic Gardens, I see this as one of our primary goals now, is the educating of the general public, that we must dispel this ignorance of how the world works in order to protect it. Thank you.